Okay. He was saying it. Okay, so we started off. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would say that is it. That's one of our, you know, the one we just last year. We were driving, camping with last year, when second period. Oh, that's not more. Yeah, second period. Well, that movie. And is there a new version? Is there one of the two older? No, it's not that old. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So somebody was trying to uh, really get the president to address that achievement gap, weren't they? it was interesting to watch the pivot just a little bit, right? So yes, as well as that, we need to talk about this as well. So that was what's that? No, yeah, no, but you have to be right and strategic.
So people are better at it.
Some people care, right? There are other people who right, right. So I do think that it's interesting that they have a escalator going up, but not one coming down, going on the side. I think that's very interesting. Oh, wow, that's a mind blower. Like, what's that? They do that in investment?
Go down.
Get out.
So from an 88 perspective here, that's a little.
Well, yeah, it is interesting, and I don't know that I saw an elevator on that side, but obviously it has to be ADA compliant, or I don't think they would be able to operate. And it's wide enough for for a wheelchair if you wanted to put one on there. That's it.
Well, I guess I had one. I thought you were.
Cool. Does everyone? So we will be writing and we'll be interacting and whatnot. Do folks have pens? Do you need pens? Okay, cool. Because I brought some just in case. So. I'm running the night. It looks like. We're set to start at what time? 9:15. So we're about 5 minutes behind. So yeah, no. Yeah, no. Which is what you're supposed to do at a conference with your colleagues from across the state, right? So I have a kindergartner. After crying, said she's been in school for 3 weeks. And, the first week I was, okay with it, because I go to work, he goes to school, we all have a role. And now I'm like, but this is stuff she has to deal with or with other kids, it's just, whew. I have much respect for my parents. Like I called my parents and I was like, I apologize. Like I just want to say how sorry I am for all the goofy stuff I demanded and all this stuff. So so we're at dinner, and my daughter says, one of her friends is sad. And I was like, oh, why is she sad? You know, like you do as a parent, right? And so my daughter said, well, her mom was bleeding. And I said, oh. I said, what, did she have an accident? She said, yeah, her dad hit her, and the mom was bleeding, and the police came and took the dad away. And I'm like,
Would you like more peas?
I'm like, how do you even engage with this, And so we ended up, I called the school, and I talked to the teacher, and the technical teacher and told her the situation. And the kid, my daughter doesn't know names. She was like, it's the girl with the beads. And so I was like, it's the girl with the beads. And the teacher was like, okay, I got two girls with beads that nailed it down. So, but just that, and then just the challenges, like last night, she said, do you think I'm a beautiful girl? I'm like, of course you are, but like, where is this question coming from? Like, why is that even whatever? So I'm just like overwhelmed and gushing with stuff. So those of you who have nieces, nephews, children, grandchildren, hug on those babies as much as you can. It's just so. All right. So we're about 5 minutes behind. I think we're a pretty intimate group. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just get started. So cool. So first and foremost, my name is Koen, and I would be remiss if I didn't recognize that I come into this room with privilege and power. I come into the room with privilege and power. I am a cisgendered male. I am a conservative Christian. My primary language is English. I've been educated in Western schools, so I have degrees after my last name. I don't have any felonies. I don't know if I'm upper, lower class, or lower middle class. I'm not sure where I fall in that. I am the recipient of the conquest of Indian lands. I'm 6'2". I'm mildly attractive and extremely humble. So all of those things give me privilege as I walk around. And so what I'd like for you to do is to just take a moment and think about your own privileges. What privileges do you have, either that you've earned or that have been given to you? Okay? So many of the privileges that I talked about, some were things that I earned, and others were given to me by the context that I'm in. So we can just think about that for a second. All right. So typically when people talk about power and privilege, how is that crouched? Or what is has anyone been engaged in conversations around power and privilege? All right. So how are those conversations usually had, or what's the tenor of those conversations? That people feel badly about their privilege. Okay? People typically tilt to this concept of white privilege, right? How else is that conversation wrapped in the context that's been had, or how do people?
Sometimes people like turning around and they have earned it.
Yeah. So as you thought about your own privileges, do you have some? Yeah, I would say that most of us do, right? Particularly, well, I won't go into the particulars. You can think about those for yourself, right? Are there also things, if you use your privilege in a different context, might actually be a liability for you? So context is extremely important when we even talk about this idea of power and privilege. Now, what I'd like to say to you as well is that, well, I'll just quote Ben Parker from Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility, right? So it's not so much if you have power, or if you have privilege, it's what do you do with the power and privilege that you have. So one of the things that you'll hear me as a mantra throughout the session is, I don't want you to be upset, confused, dismayed by the power or privilege that you have, either that you've earned or that's been granted to you. My curiosity is, what do you do with the power and the privilege that you have? And so, if our answer is nothing, then that tells you how you choose to use your gift. If you don't know, this is an opportunity to data mine yourself and figure out how and why I might use my gift differently. All right? So, the first thing I'd like to do is, each of you, there's a handout right in front of you, and at the first put your name on it, because sometimes people, well, you'll see why it might be important to put your name on it. So you put your name on it somewhere. And then the next thing I'd like for you to do is, there are 4 circles at the bottom of that page, and I'd like for you to put one thing that you value or one thing that is important to you in each one of those circles at the bottom. All right? So one thing that is of value to you or important to you at the bottom of that paper. All right? One in each of those circles. Bless you. All right. So it looks like most people have 4, but 3 if not all 4. So we'll proceed. What I'd like you to do is to play a game with me. It's very simple. What I want you to do is, I want you to find a minimum of 2 people for each one of the things that you wrote down, and I want people to sign on things that they either agree with, that's a great idea, or they have on their paper that's similar, right? So I want you to find a minimum of 2 people for each one of those things, which means there are 4 circles. If you get a minimum, you'll have how many signatures? 8, right? So a minimum of 8 signatures, 2 on each of those at a minimum. You have 90 seconds to do it starting now.
We can only do it once, right?
You can do it as many times as meets the criteria. Four, three, two, one, and game over. So is there anyone that was not able to find any signatures at all? Is there anyone that has a totally blank? All right, cool. So we were all able to at least make one connection. As you were walking around the room, were there things you saw in other people's papers that you were like, oh, I should have wrote that down, or I value that too? What was one of those things?
Learning and growth.
Learning and growth.
Learning and I'm like, oh yeah, that's it.
That is it. All right. What else? Nature. You saw that on someone else's, and you value nature. All right. What? Integrity. Right. So those are things that we wrote down in our paper too. Right. Were there also things that were more difficult to find someone to sign on, or you actually didn't find anyone to sign on those things? What was one of those things? Generosity. Please raise your hand if you value generosity, even if it wasn't written on your paper. All right? So these are all potential folks that we could have found. What was something else?
Service or giving back.
Giving.
I should have connected with her.
Yeah, but service or the social of giving back. If you value that, even if it wasn't written on your paper, raise your hand. All right? Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Anything else? Health. Raise your hand if you value health. I'm going to raise both my hands, right? I have, everybody's got bronchitis in my household right now. So health, right? So we're a pretty smart group. We see the title, we're more alike. We did this activity. What do you think is the point of this activity? Why would I engage in this activity at the beginning of a session with this title, and with you in particular? To establish our values. And our commonalities.
But even I was thinking like this is like not math industry, like yeah, we could look at this like this. We have something that we agree with.
You have some things that you agree on. You have similar values. What else did you notice about those things that were on people's papers? That we are, in fact, more alike. And what else? And we get a sense of who they are. And we are very different. We are very different. Now, this is one of those things that is a very difficult concept for people to recognize, that we can actually hold both of those in our mind at the same time. That we are very much alike and we are very different, and we can hold those two thoughts simultaneously. Okay? So when I talk about diversity, or I think about diversity, and you may want to write this down someplace as an expansion of however you use or lexicon you use for talking about diversity, but it is actually, the way I like to think about it, it is the recognition and the honoring of our commonalities and our differences. Right? So diversity really is this honoring, this accountability, accounting of our commonalities and our differences. Because if we don't recognize both of those things, we can succumb to what I call obstacle illusions. Obstacle illusions. Artificial barriers to authentic human relationships. Right? And so what are some of those obstacle illusions that if we're looking at just differences or just similarities that we might fall into? What might be some of those societal categories that we may fall into if we're just looking at commonalities or we're just looking at differences?
that are made up of different members, especially different adults, have different values,
Mhm.
rather than, looking past that assumption.
Yeah, we can make
Finding common realities in those adults, caregivers, of
we can make assumptions about what families are and what they're not, what family values are and what family values aren't, right? We can fall into that category. What other social categories can we fall into if we're just looking at differences or just looking at similarities? Gender, right? We can fall into these gender categories. Now, people will talk about the biology, right? So there's, there's male and there's female, and then there's intersex, right? But that's different than gender and gender identity, right? Because that changes from context to context. When I was in North Africa, in Egypt, men would walk arm in arm, hold hands, swing hands together. Here, in this context, that would mean something different depending on who is the observer, right? Not even the participants oftentimes don't even have a chance to define what this stuff is for other folks, but the observers do, right? And so gender. I would also suggest that race is one of those things, right? It is funny. My wife is biracial. So my daughter is triracial. I'm an African American or American Black or however you want to talk about that, and my mix is so widely. I'm an alchemist, right? I'm a result of alchemy, right? So all of that stuff is very interesting. But my daughter never gets to say that she's white. She'll never get to say that. Like there's no benefit to her in saying that, and whatever. Like there should be anyway. But I'm not saying there should be. I'm saying like there should be. Right? So anyway. So that's interesting that even those categories, right? And I'll just let you know something about me. I was not born black. I'm not suffering from a reverse Michael Jackson thing. I'm good. I'm okay, right? So in 1970, when I was born, we used to do archaic things in the 70s with babies, right? And so I was born, the doctor turned me upside down and he slapped me. And how do you think I responded to that? No, I slapped him back. You just don't do that to people, right? I just got here, right? No. So that's an old Richard Pryor joke and the only one I can tell, right? No. So he hands me to the nurse. The nurse starts to take my vitals. She goes through her checklist, how long he is, how much he weighs, and then she gets to the part of her checklist that changes the trajectory of my life forever. It's the category of race. And in Dayton, Ohio, in 1970, there were 3 categories: black, white, and other. And so she looks at my family, she looks at her list, she looks at me, she looks at her list, she looks at my family, and she makes her decision. And what decision do you think she makes? No, black. However, what was I before she made that distinction? Yeah. I was born human, but America made me black. Did you know that there are no Hispanics in Mexico? There are no Hispanics in Mexico. Yes.
Yeah, that's taking those something that always I always believe we call ourselves by our so it's not just that you just say that you are a black person. And one person wanted to say that there is no white, there's no black, there's no English, we call ourselves the people. We care.
Yep, and I will tell you that I appreciate that, and I believe that we will get there. I don't think we're there now, right? And so part of the reason, and I'll just be forthright. Yeah.
Also we say whether African American or Latino or this or that, but when it comes to those people who are not those categories like patriarchal or information, why do you not call them European?
So Yeah, and I can answer that specifically with data and history, right? So part of it is they did, right? So there were Irish American hyphen Americans, there were Italian hyphen American, and that kind of stuff. And so as the progression of the pervasiveness of whiteness, and we'll talk a little bit about that in our session. Some of those differences became less important and melded into this concept of whiteness. I call myself black as opposed to African American because I want to define how I get called, right? So other people who may have my same skin tone may prefer African American or of African descent, and those are their ways of interacting. But I choose blackness because my father was a Black Panther, because he was black and proud. The parts of my ancestry latched onto that identity, and I want to honor that for them as well as for myself, right? So part of that is that. The other part is to recognize that the conqueror always gets to tell the story, right? So when one catches a fish, anyone been fishing? And you've told that story, or you have people who've caught fish and they tell the story over and over and over again. I don't know about you, but every time my uncle tells his story, the fish gets longer, the struggle was harder, but I've never heard the fish's side of the story. And so when we think about the systems that we're operating in, and this is something that people, and you'll hear this, and you got to combat this stuff, right? So you'll hear this in the wider world, that people want to revise history, or they want revisionist history. And so some of that you'll see with the rescinding or the changing of Columbus Day, right? And it is not that folks want to erase what happened. What we want is to tell the full truth about what happened. Christopher Columbus did some innovative and genius things in figuring out how to do the transatlantic trade and stuff that he did. But he also did some dastardly things as well. And to be quite honest, if we look at our own lives, there are some things that we've done really well, but there have also been some things that we haven't done so well. And those are the things that don't show up on Facebook, right? And so if we look at our history and at our history book that we're teaching in school, what we're teaching is the Facebook version of real people's lives, right? And so, so why do we do that? Mostly because we're responding to. I will tell you that since census were taken, the categorization for people who fit my description has changed almost every census, right? And so, nobody ever asked me what I want to be called, right? So just in my lifetime, I've been colored, I've been black, Afro-American, African-American. Just in my short lifetime, all these categories have been applied. So I get to define how I want to be called, right? And so I encourage other people to do the same. And to respect when people say, gender pronouns is a really interesting thing, right? So I don't know about in your spheres of influence, but that's something that people are really having some struggles with, gender pronouns. And I don't understand why. I do understand why, but I don't understand why at the same time, right? So has anyone ever seen or heard these introductory tags that we put on names of Mr. and Mrs., right? Does anyone know what those are short for? Because those are abbreviations. What's that? Master, right? So does anyone know the difference between a master and a mister? So a master is over the age of 18 and owns things. That is a master. And a mister is someone under the age of 18 with the hopes of one day owning things. So that's mister, right? So what do you think Mrs. is? the masters, apostrophe S. So when we refer to women as Mrs., we are saying that she is owned by the master. Now, if we walked around saying that people, well, hello, Master Jim, or hello, Master, owned by Master Jim, people would say that that was archaic, barbaric, and not representative of how we want to be, right? Yes. Yes.
Well, I came to Latin America, and one of the most dominant countries when women got married, they had to give you the Japanese of your husband. Which means, for example, I'm Garcia, I married one from De Garcia, which means belongs
To,
Garcia.
yes.
You know, in some countries, like the way in my five countries, they don't allow that. You are going to marry a woman from a white country, you want her to give you nothing, you are already born. But you won't allow it. But that's similar.
So very similar. So the thing I think is very interesting is that both have roots from the same colonized mindset, right? Both have roots in the same colonized mindset. And so, if we have those augmentations occurring today, where we use that less, and I'll say ma'am and sir, and people, particularly in Minnesota, will say, don't say that, that's my dad, right? Or that's my mom. If we can do that, we can also do the same with gender pronouns, right? And so it's the next step. So I've deviated from my original plan, but let's keep going. So on your cover, there's also a larger circle. So there's commonalities and differences, that is diversity. Let's look at this larger circle. So this is the circle of all human knowledge. Okay, it's a little melodramatic, right? But let's say that this is a pie of knowledge. What I'd like for you to do is to cut yourself a piece of pie the size of what you know of everything there is to know. All right? So right on that larger circle, cut yourself a piece of pie of what you know of everything there is to know. Everything. All history, math, science, religions, languages, cultures. So draw yourself a piece of pie the size of what you know of everything there is to know. All right? What might be contained in that piece of pie for you? What's something? 3 things. What are 3 things you, as a collective, may know? You know something because you made it. You made it to deck.
You know how to drive.
Okay, you know how to drive. All right. What's another? Something you know for sure. You know your own lived experience, and what was that? The sun rises in the east, right? So those are things you know. All right? What I'd like for you to do now is to cut a second piece of pie, which is the size of what you are aware of that you do not know. You know you don't know this, right? So for me, I don't know Mandarin Chinese. I also don't know how to fly an airplane, and I don't know how to do open heart surgery. Right? So those are things that I know that I don't know. So I want you to quantify that. You may have a tendency or leaning to say, well, that's just the rest of the pie. I want you to quantify that because we will address a third piece in just a second. All right? So your first piece is what you know. The second is what you know you don't know. What are some examples of things that you are aware of that you do not know? Trigonometry. Please raise your hand if you also know you don't know trigonometry. All right? Cool. Something else. Okay, yeah, multiple languages, right? Raise your hand if you know you don't know multiple languages. All right, cool. Yes.
I don't know what you think.
All right, you don't know what I think you feel, right? So you only know your learned experience, so you don't know other people's, right? So we have what we know, we have what we know we don't know, and what do you think is the third part? What you don't know, or your blind spot. So if you can write those 2 words in that space, blind spot. Blind spot. So if we combine all 3 of those pieces, we get this pie. And I would like to title this pie, and if you could just write a line next to it or label that circle as your paradigm. Paradigm. I used to say paradigm. I was hooked on phonics. It worked for me, right? So paradigm. So what is a paradigm? Or how has it been used? Have you heard paradigm used? All right, so it's how you see and how you think of something. People talk about shifting your paradigm, right? Malcolm McDowell has a book, a tipping point, right? It talks about when paradigms shift or change, or when they need to. So how do we define a paradigm? How else have people heard it used? So it could be a reference point or a preference point. So I taught middle school, and I used some of these activities with my middle schoolers, so I know they work. And one of the things that we would talk about as a paradigm is, and you may want to write this down as a definition, it is simply the way you see the world. The way you see the world is your paradigm. And consequently, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. We don't see it as it is, we see it as we are. So if I want to change the world, what must I first change? Me. Right? Change me. So who is responsible, or where did you get this gift of a paradigm? What was your first introduction to a paradigm? So your family, your community, the people who raised you, right? And where did they get their paradigm? From the same sources, right? And where did they get their paradigm? From the same sources. Anyone ever received a copy of 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 a copy? You ever received one of those, right? Does that seventh generation of the copy look exactly like the original? No. Why? So how did it change? So sometimes it becomes blurry. What else? How is it different? Sometimes things are missing, right? So words get deleted. Sometimes people add notes to it, or there's, because of the copying process, there may be dirt on the thing, and it gets added to that copy, and then that gets replicated, right? So is it possible that the paradigms that we were given might not be helpful for the context that we're in? I would argue that it's a possibility, right? My parents, loving, caring, powerful people, taught me to be loving, caring, and powerful. Could never have taught me about sexting. Using texts to have intimate relationships with other human beings. Why could my parents have never taught me about that? It didn't exist, right? So there may be opportunities that we've missed or are missing because of just the context that we're in. And it is not our fault, but it is our responsibility. We'll talk more about that in just a second. All right, so let's open up your handbook. Because when we succumb to these obstacle illusions, we end up creating, and it's a natural human tendency to create these in-groups and out-groups. All right? So what I'd like you to do is, if you can get into groups of, it looks like 3 is probably the best number. If you can get into groups of 3, and I want you to address the questions at the top of that page about in-group and out-group. So the first is, I want you to think to yourself about a time when you were a part of an in-group. And then I want you to describe a time when you were a part of an out-group. All right? And go through the rest of this page and about in-groups and out-groups, and then we'll come back together as a full group. All right? I'll give about maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes to do this activity,
in a small group. All right, so if you get into groups of three, that would be wonderful. Yes.
Can you tell me what you mean, in-group, out-group?
Yeah. Can someone give me an idea or a way to express this concept of in group? What would be an in group?
One that is socially popular and others, I guess, would want to be a part of.
All right.
It's exclusionary, but it's kind of exclusionary.
Okay. So a group that is popular, where you get lots of benefits, would be an in group. Um, an example might be, no, we have it in this room. There are people who don't speak English. I am not speaking their language. They are in the out group. Who all is in the in group? All those who speak English are in the in group. Okay? And so, are there situations where you have been a part of an in group? And the in group being one that has easy access, benefits. All right, cool. So if you can get into groups of 3 or 4, that would be great. 1 minute warning. Four, three, two, one, and so I'm curious as you're having conversations, and feel free to continue to have conversations. I love this methodology for looking at things because I won't give away my punchline on this, but and I'll tell you why in just a second. But as you're going through this exercise, what were you discovering either in your conversation or about your own thinking as it related to this idea of in-group and out-group? Yes.
So one of the things we talked about is how there's like the strong unconscious preservation of when we're in the in group. We do things that we don't even realize we're doing to like preserve that.
Yeah.
And you know, when people are in out group and they're in the in group, they hate it when they were in out group, but they did in the in group, and we sort of like follow along to again preserve that structure of what the in group is. It's a very often unconscious way of thinking.
Yeah, it's very, very unconscious, right? I mean, this idea of assimilation, right? So, short story. Used to have dreads down to my waist, right? Got gigs like this all the time. But when apply for corporate jobs, nothing, right? Cut it, slick it. And talent and age and all this kind of stuff goes with that too, right? And so it's not just that, but it is interesting where I show up differently now than when I was countercultural, right? Counterculture. The other things that folks notice as you're going through this exercise, yes.
We talked about sometimes context can shape whether you're in the or out of the space on the same.
Yeah, right. Can you say more? Because that's.
We were talking about being a working mom, and that sometimes being a working mom, you feel like that some stay-at-home moms feel like the working mom, and you're being stay-at-home mom, so that like now they're not as valued because they're not working outside of the home.
Right.
And in other situations, that if you're a working mom, there are a bunch of moms who are not working, and you feel like now you're that out group because you have to go to work, and they're able to do it.
Right.
That can help with it.
Right. In my neighborhood, I have privilege and power that many of you may not have in my neighborhood. Right? I can go to the person and know how to get stuff done, and you may not necessarily know that in a different context. Right? Other things. Say more about that.
That a church can be welcoming, but it can be very unwelcoming too, depending on the context of where you are in that.
How dare you sit in my unofficial pew, right? Everybody knows that that's my pew, right? Or some version of that, right? Yeah. In group, out group. So what does it take for someone to be a leader with this recognition that this kind of thing is happening all the time? What kinds of skills are necessary to bridge in-group, out-group situations, right? And here's one I think is really interesting, and I'll just throw this out there. So, anyone ever heard of BET, Black Entertainment Television? Right? So some news cable station was complaining about BET and how black people want to be separate from the rest of everybody. Why do they even need a BET? Now, I'm not saying this is the hallmark of the pinnacle of black existence, but it is a point, right? And the funny thing about BET is that it was created in response to MTV not playing black videos other than Billy Ocean and Michael Jackson. Right? Those are the only two black videos they would show. And so black folks said, well, look, we'll create our own. So they create their own. It becomes successful. Years later, people now point back to that adaptation as a problem because these people want to be separate. Well, it is interesting. They didn't want to let them in the in group in the first place, and now that they have a cool out group that is now a new in group, folks want to complain, right? And the same thing, you'll see it with cultures throughout our region. It's funny, the number of people who complained about either the Somali Mall over on Lake Street, or complained about the Hmong end of university, right? They're taking over and all that kind of stuff. When in fact, all they're doing is on the other end of Lake Street with the Latinx folks who have those stores and whatnot. All folks are trying to do is adapt to the context and survive, but then it gets flipped on them that they're taking over. Right? When Ma and Pa from Little House on the Prairie, anyone remember that show? Right? What was their thing? To survive as pioneers moving west. And so they went and they went into other places, and we saw that as a good and proud thing. But when people move from Chicago to St. Peter, we say they're taking over, they're moving. Or people move from Guatemala, who's in a turmoil that the CIA started anyway, and they come to this country to get some relief and get a better life. We villainize them for doing the same thing that Ma and Pa did as pioneers in the thing. And so it takes leadership to be able to have cognitive control and recognize these things, right? And so what is cognitive control? So let's go to that next page, right? So cognitive control. There's some definitions you can look at there, but I really want to focus on the three things that most folks are after. And having this ability to look at cognitive control allows us to think about this in a concrete way, right? So what are the in-group? I would suggest that the in-group and the out-group are after the same things. Right? The in-group and out-group are after the same things. They are after significance, belonging, and safety. Significance says that I'm a person with purpose and power, and I can do stuff in the world. I can be actionable, right? And I can either decide what my purpose is, or the heavens can open up and let me know. Right? So purpose. We're all looking for purpose to use our power. So significance is this notion that I have purpose and power. Belonging suggests that I want to be in relationships with people who understand my purpose and my power. And I submit to you, for me, oftentimes it's my friends or the circles that I elect to be a part of that recognize that, oftentimes more so than my own family members, right? And then lastly, we want to be physically, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually safe to be in relationships with people who understand our significance. right? And so when we think about the motivations of the in-group and out-group, are those motivations pure as it relates to these things? Do we at least understand their motivations according to these things? Yes, right? But typically what drives the in and out group is the methods of getting these things that oftentimes can be problematic, right? Why do kids join gangs? I would say it's probably a combination of all of these things, right? Why do kids join 4-H? Same thing. So what's the difference between the kids in the gang and the 4-H kids? Methods. And however you define positive and negative, which are judgment statements, is an interesting thing, right? So is there leadership development in a gang? Yes, there's leadership development in a gang. Is there strategic planning and organization in a gang? There is. Are mathematics and higher level thinking happening in a gang situation? Of course they are, right? So I wonder, what would happen if Extension adopted gangs? If we went out with a program and said, we want to adopt this gang, we want to teach you leadership skills that are different than the ones you've been learning. I wonder what would happen. I wonder if the shootings in St. Paul would actually go down because they know something different to use with those skills. There was a money management woman who came to the school that I was working at, and she said this, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. She said, how many of you are hustlers, right? And hustlers, whatever you come up with, and kids, someone would raise their hands just because they wanted to be cool in front of their other friends or whatever. And she said, I don't want you to stop being a hustler. I want you to change what you hustle. And so if we're really about extending an extension, I wonder what that might look like, right? Safety, significance, and belonging. What we also recognize is that impact and intent are two different things and they're relational, right? So if I'm walking down the hall and I make an incursion on someone's physical space in a way that gratifies me but not them, what might we call that? Sexual assault or sexual harassment or harassment, right? Do you care what my intent was? No, you don't. It doesn't matter, right? So now we're going down this HR path, regardless of my intention. However, how many people have given a gift or received a gift that wasn't worth much, but you valued the gift? I mean, monetarily, it wasn't worth very much, but you valued the gift. Why? Because the intention was there, because there was a relationship, right? So, intent matters when you have a relationship with folks. Otherwise, we're just measuring impact, right? Got to speed along because I think my time. How am I on time? 15, 30. I got 30 minutes left. Okay, cool. So I want to make sure we hit this. I heard a lot of clapping over there. I thought they were clapping because they were ending. I was like, whoa. All right, cool. So let's turn to the next page. Questions, comments, observations so far. I'm hitting you with a lot of stuff. I hope it's not too much. Yes. Okay, good. Okay, good. So cognitive control becomes really important because if we don't take cognitive control, we operate with the illusion of knowledge, right? And we'll talk about the illusion of knowledge in just a second. So I like using the triune brain model only because my middle schoolers could get that rather than looking at the anatomy and all that kind of stuff. And I can talk about it in 45 minutes and get it done and get to the next unit. But we know that this triune brain model, there's a reptilian brain, there's a mammalian brain, and the prefrontal cortex, which does executive functions, right? So if all else fails, our brainstem and our reptile brain, the most primitive part of our brain, it's not an alien conspiracy thing to talk about the reptile brain. It is actually, So I had that question once. They're like, is that an alien conspiracy? No, it's not. All right? So this reptilian brain is just a survival mode, right? Now, what I will tell you is that if I can hijack these executive functions and get straight to this, I have control over you. I have control over you. So how does that happen? So first of all, fight or flight. To people, anyone ever heard of this? Is how we deal with conflict, right? We either fight, right? So there's a nuance that's important to recognize about that. That we fight or flight. And it's actually flight is what we're doing because we fight enough to get away, right? But if people just like to fight, then there's something wrong. There's another thing we got to talk about, right? So this idea of fight or flight. But this is all about survival. And so, Maslow's hierarchy would suggest, or even the safety, significance, and belonging would suggest, if you are going to lose those things, what might you do to not lose them? I'm going to fight to keep them, right? If on the front page I said one of those things that you value, if I said that was that you can't value that any longer, or I'm going to take that away, would I have a struggle in my hands? I would, right? So what we recognize is that we have these executive functions, our ability to make decisions. However, there is a way to hijack this executive function by going straight to this reptile brain. And do you know how that happens in mass media? Anyone ever seen a commercial that made you feel better about yourself because you saw the commercial? What are most commercials suggesting? That you are deficit until when? You buy their product, right? You buy their product. Or you'll hear news, cable news stations, they're coming after your stuff. They want to take what's yours. And now it's time for a commercial. Do you suffer from anxiety? Do you take this pill and the side effects are memory loss and you lose a limb and if you forget who you are, call your doctor. Right? All those things, right? So they hijack that. So what we also have to recognize is that bigotry, prejudice, and discrimination may not necessarily be what we've always thought they were. That they could be something different if we look at this triune brain model, right? So we know that discrimination is a what? It's an action, right? It's an action, which means it might fall into this executive function, right? Bigotry. How many people have experienced a bigot, know a bigot, have seen a bigot on TV? What are some of the characteristics of a bigot? So they are sure that they are right. What else? They have limited viewpoint. They oftentimes are bullied. All right. So when I've encountered, so there was a bigot that was America's favorite bigot when I was growing up. His name was Archie Bunker. He was on a show called All in the Family. And if you go back and try to watch those shows, you'll just be appalled at what we were able to do on TV back in those days, right? So this idea of bigotry. And Archie had someone in his life named Mike. And Mike was his his son-in-law. And so his son-in-law would say, Arch, you have this antiquated way of thinking. This is a new way of thinking. Or here's some data to support a different way of thinking. And what would Archie's response be to anything that Mike would try to give him? Does anybody remember the little catchphrase? Shut up, meathead. Right? So he said, shut up, meathead. And so I know that I've encountered bigots, and when I've encountered them, I've given them data and statistics and information, and the more I give them, the more they dig in, and the more I give them, the more they dig in, until finally they tell me the root of their problem. And they say, Andre, I don't care what you say, this is how I feel. Oh, so bigotry is an emotional state. Bigotry is an emotion. So how do you change emotions? Do data, statistics, and charts change emotions? They don't. What changes emotions? Another emotion. And I would say, if I wasn't in a professional environment, I would say love is the strongest. But in a professional environment, I would call it allophilia, or positive regard. Okay? So to change a bigot, you have to give them compassion, even when they don't earn it. And that's the only way you can change that. Right? Is that for everybody? No! But for those of us who are leaders, those of us who are looking to bridge the gaps between the in group and the out group, who have some cognitive awareness of what needs to be done, this kind of stuff is our saving grace. What would happen if Extension adopted a white nationalist group? What are they after? Safety, significance, and belonging. What is their problem? Their methods. Their methods. Trying to help solve this problem, this world problem, right? I've been thinking about this stuff a lot. And I think about the fact that when I first moved to St. Paul, I was teaching at a charter school, and there were these white kids who came in with sagging pants, hat cocked to the side, with this swagger. And I was like, why are these white kids acting black? And then I had to check myself and say, well, what makes that black? Right? And then I went back to why are these kids acting like that? And guess why? Guess what I figured out? Guess what they told me? Because that's what works in the environment that they're in. They're responding to the environment that they're in. They're blending in, they're assimilating to those things. And so what I had to teach all of my students, is that there are times when the sagging pants and the hat cocked to the side may be a strategic advantage for you. But that's not true in all places. So you may want to make the choice to look at how you want to adapt so you can be best suited until you can get that place to change how they look at people, right? So there's that. Prejudice is a frozen mindset. It's a way of thinking that gets frozen, right? And how do you thaw a mindset? You thaw a mindset through strategic questions, through the Socratic method. You challenge people to think about their thinking, to use their metacognition. We are Homo sapiens sapiens, the ones who know we exist. So if we're not thinking about our thinking, I submit to you that we may not be living to the full potential of our human existence, right? So you get people to think. And if we can get them to feel differently, and we can get them to think differently, then we can ultimately get them to act differently. Right? Get them to act differently. Just fun stuff, we'll get to that in just a second. When you hit this before time runs out on me. So in your handout, you'll see this chart. And what I'd like for you to do is to tell me what you learned growing up, either in the United States, outside of the United States, the time frame, rural, urban, wherever you are. Tell me what you learned from this group of people, so the folks in the blue, these groups in the blue. What did you learn from them about these particular groups across the top? With the recognition that all groups are not associated with. I don't have all the groups that I could have on here. This is for demonstration purposes only. Right? So, if you learn something positive from your parents and families about Latino or Latina Americans, I want you to put a plus if you learn something positive. If you learn something negative from friends about disabled Americans, I want you to put a minus. If there was never a conversation had about a particular group, or neutral about that particular group, I want you to put a 0, right? So if there was nothing ever said, you can have pluses and minuses in the same box, but the size matters, right? So a big plus means lots of positive, and a little minus means a little bit of negative. All right? So, an example, school and workplace. What did they teach you about African Americans? Was it a plus, a minus, or a zero, or a plus and a minus? Right? TV, movies, and media. Native Americans, plus, minus, or zero. All right? So I'll give you about 2 minutes to get started on that. All right? Thank you so much. Four, three, two, one. If you can get back into small groups, I'm going to give you probably about another 4 minutes or so to talk in your 4 groups about your pluses, your minuses, and your zero. You can do the same groups, or you can do a different group, however you want, but 3 or 4 people in that group, please. Thank you. Where? Four, three, two, one, and so I'm curious to. So I don't need to know what you have pluses and minuses or zeros in. Um, that's for you and your assessment and your small group conversation. But I am interested in any thoughts or feelings that came up for you as you were putting pluses, minuses, and zeros on the chart of the graph. Any thoughts or feelings come up for folks? Yes.
And so, seeing really where those influences come into the TV and movies, that really kind of shapes how we, our opinions what certain ones might share.
Okay. Else. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Yes.
I want to push back on the concept of a lack of exception being one of these values. I, I also grew up in a family that didn't talk about perception with people who are different than us, but I don't think that was because of neutrality. I think that was because of the comfort in the status quo. And so the privilege was not feeling the need to talk about how other people are perceiving you. It's like the way we perceive people is just normal. Because there's no reason to talk.
So I have I have a 5-year-old, and I remember when she was 3 or 4, we were at the state fair, and so we're walking down the thing, and my daughter sees a woman a white woman who has a dark birthmark on her face, right? And my daughter does what all parents are afraid will happen, right? So she takes her little finger and she points at the woman and she says, "Dad, look at her." What is the natural response that most people will probably take in that situation? Shh, don't point at her. Da, 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 right? So that's a lesson. And it's not in neutrality. Right? Oftentimes what we don't do is tell the kid what just happened. Because all they saw was some of the thing. And so my daughter does, and it's a big thing. And you can see the woman brace herself. This isn't the first time this ever happened to her, so she's kind of bracing herself. And I say to my daughter, "And isn't that beautiful?" My daughter says, "Yeah, it is beautiful." What did I do? I took a side, right? So I wasn't neutral, right? And I would submit to you that there are probably many things that we said as children, that we did as children, that people didn't tell us about, but we made stories about what that meant, right? So who do we have at dinner? Who didn't we have at dinner? Who do we see in school? What movies did we watch? What magazines were in our homes? Those are all, and this is a lead into my next point, which is a statement of values, right? So these are all statements of values. And so when we think about these pluses, minuses, and zeros, what I knew or didn't know growing up was not my fault, but it is my responsibility to do something about it. And there is no such thing as being neutral on anything. Everything is a decision. Everything is a decision. And it has a cause and it has an effect. Sometimes it's a correlation, sometimes it's a correspondence, right? But there is no such thing as neutrality, right? So at the bottom of that page is When Prejudice Hurts. There's what they ended up calling this woman, Permit Patty or something like that, who was calling because a black family was having a barbecue in a park or whatever, and that's at a Soul Train rally making fun of that. But then there's some more egregious instances where a white police officer went to the wrong apartment and shot someone based on her own prejudging, right? So that prejudging hurts. And then at the bottom is Mr. Sterling getting shot by a police officer, and then in another situation, a white man with mace who just killed 3 people are chasing police officers, right? He happens to be white. Mr. Sterling happens to be black, right? So that prejudice has some real consequences. And the real question is, are we looking at repulsion? Are we looking at avoidance? Are we looking at tolerance, acceptance, or appreciation? And I would suggest that appreciation is what we want to aim towards. On the next page, our values are actually the things that motivate us to do things, right? So 35W bridge collapse happens, and people run towards the danger. There's a bus full of children on this thing, and bystanders run to help the children at the bus. Did they have necessarily, I don't know if it's been confirmed, that they had the skills, the resources, the knowledge to actually go and be helpful, but they went. And why did they go? Because of their values, right? And what values would cause someone to run to danger? The value of life, of helping, being service to others. So, the false narrative that we have to have the right stuff to actually do something and be helpful is undermined by stuff like this. Right? So we don't. We have to have the right values. We have to believe in our values enough to recognize those. On the next page are Brazilness. They also have another name. And many of you may be familiar with that other name, right? And that name people used to use back in the day is called the N-word toes. They used to refer to these as the N-word toes. But if someone was going to use it, that relative, that family member who would call them that, goes into Trader Joe's and sees these, on sale, and they say, "Oh my goodness, it's those!" What would we say to that family member? How would we interact with that family member? Yep, we shut them down, right? Another way to think about that is to have conversations with them about how the context is different. In some cases, this may be the only way they've ever known to address that. So to do that would be to shut them down. Respect is never something that we earn. We never earn respect. As leaders, we have to give respect in the face of disrespect. Is it easy to respect someone who respects you? Yeah, that's easy. Anybody can do that. But it takes a special kind of person, a leader, to be able to respect someone who is disrespectful to them. On the back are some ways to start thinking about taking control of your behavior and having cognitive control. So we know that behavior is an outcome, and it is a combination of emotions and thoughts. And so have positive thoughts and create positive environments around you so that people can have positive feelings, and ultimately they'll end up having positive behaviors, right? So cognitive behavior therapy. The triune brain model is on the back, and then this intercultural development model or continuum really talks about how we move from being monocultural, being just an in-group, and how to actually invite the out-group into our in-group, right? So as leaders, if you look at the in-group and out-group, leaders are able to draw a bigger circle around both, right? So as leaders, when we think about Dr. King, he drew a bigger circle than just the two that were presented. He said we all can be a part of that. And so as leaders, when we think about white nationalists, and we think about gang members, and we think about our troubled youth in our rural areas, they all want the same thing, but we just need to draw a bigger circle to include them and recognize that if we give them knowledge, skills, and abilities, they will be able to be actionable in the world. The worst thing you can do to a young person is give them hope. That's the worst thing you can do, give them hope. Without skills. Right? So give them hope, you give them skills. And that's what I love about 4-H, right? 4-H allows young people to develop skills that can sustain the hopes they have for their lives. My name is Andre Koen. Thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate you joining me. You could have been any place else, but I appreciate you being here with me today. Thank you so much. Any questions, comments, observations? I think we have like a minute or so. Yes, please. Oh, good. Thank you. I'm glad you stayed too. Cool. So I do bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs as well as funerals. I'm a riot at funerals. No.
Yeah, no, I don't.
You might be healthier now.
I'm also paying for it too. There's someone in here right after me, right? So I gotta clean up quickly.